Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. Landon Mitchell had mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing. His mother called it being professionally unemployed, but he preferred to think of himself as selectively motivated. At 28, he had bounced between enough jobs to know what he didn't want, anything that required actual effort. He hadn't always been this way. Back in high school, he had been on the honor roll, captain of the debate team, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. But halfway through his first year of college, his father's sudden death from a heart attack had derailed everything. The family's savings went to medical bills and funeral costs, forcing him to drop out. His mother had to take on 2 jobs just to keep their house, while Landon drifted through a series of retail positions and customer service roles. Something in him had broken during those years. Maybe it was watching his father, who had worked 60-hour weeks his entire life, die before he could even enjoy retirement. Maybe it was the soul-crushing reality of trying to climb out of debt with minimum wage jobs. Either way, Landon had gradually retreated into a shell of apathy, finding comfort in video games, social media, and the path of least resistance. He lived in his mother's basement, contributed the bare minimum to expenses, and had perfected the art of finding jobs that required minimal effort, and quitting them the moment anyone expected more. So when he saw the posting for a night security guard at Marshall's department store downtown, it seemed almost too good to be true. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and best of all, he'd be alone. No managers breathing down his neck, no customers to deal with. Just him, his phone, and 8 hours of blessed solitude. The interview with Mrs. Patterson, the store manager, was surprisingly brief. She seemed almost desperate to fill the position, though Landon couldn't figure out why. The job market wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. He'd heard stories about Marshall's, of course. Everyone in town had. The store had opened in 1947, built by Theodore Marshall, a businessman with a reputation for cutting corners and harboring strange obsessions. The mannequins had been his peculiar passion. He'd commissioned them from an artist in Vienna who specialized in creating lifelike figures for museums. But the artist had vanished mysteriously after delivering the order, leaving behind only a cryptic note about Marshall's unusual requests. There were whispers about the fire in '62 that claimed 3 lives, all night staff. Their bodies were never found in the rubble, though 3 new mannequins appeared in the store's reopening display the following month. The local papers had run stories about the coincidence, but Marshall's influence had quickly silenced them. When Theodore Marshall himself disappeared in 1965, his body was never found either. His daughter had taken over, then his granddaughter, Mrs. Patterson, maintaining the family's iron grip on the store's operations. But Landon hadn't paid much attention to local legends. Urban myths always circulated about old buildings, and this was probably just another case of small-town gossip getting out of hand. The last guard, Mr. Reynolds. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. Her fingers trembled slightly, though her voice remained steady. He left rather suddenly. Personal reasons, you understand. We need someone to start immediately. Something in her eyes suggested she knew more than she was saying, but Landon wasn't about to press the issue. Marshall stood at the heart of Millbrook, a town where progress seemed to move a little slower than everywhere else. The massive limestone building occupied nearly half a block on Main Street, its Art Deco facade rising 5 stories above the surrounding shops, like a monument to a grander era. Carved stone eagles perched at each corner of the roof, their wings spread as if ready to take flight, while elaborate friezes depicting scenes of commerce wrapped around the building's upper levels. The store's bronze-framed display windows, each 3 stories tall, reflected the sleepy town's streetlights like tired eyes. Even among Millbrook's other historic buildings, Marshall's commanded attention, less for its size than for the weight of its history. Decades of whispered stories and unexplained incidents that clung to its walls like ivy. Landon didn't ask for details about the job. He had learned long ago that the less you knew about a job, the better. Besides, what could possibly go wrong watching an empty department store at night? The first few shifts were exactly what he had hoped for. He'd make his rounds every couple of hours, play games on his phone, maybe watch some videos. The store was 5 floors of retail paradise during the day, but at night it transformed into a cathedral of shadows and silence. The Art Deco architecture took on a more sinister quality after dark. The bronze elevator doors with their geometric patterns seemed to writhe in his flashlight beam, and the marble pillars cast long shadows that looked like reaching fingers across the floor. Each department had its own distinct atmosphere at night. The perfume section was the worst, with its cloying mix of expensive fragrances growing more suffocating after hours. The children's department, with its pastel colors and cheerful displays, became somehow wrong in the darkness, especially the baby clothes section, where tiny dresses and miniature suits hung limply like empty shed skins. The jewelry counter's mirrors multiplied his flashlight beam infinitely, creating the unsettling impression that dozens of lights were moving through the store. But it was the mannequins that dominated the space. They were everywhere, posed in elegant tableaux throughout the store, frozen in eternal scenes of shopping, dining, and sophisticated conversation. During the day, they were merely odd. At night, they became an audience, silent witnesses to his solitary patrols. The only sounds were the soft hum of the ventilation system and his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Marshall's was one of those stores that seemed frozen in time. While other retailers had switched to modern, featureless mannequins, Marshall still used the vintage kind, the ones with carefully painted faces that dated back to the 1950s. Their expressions were unnervingly lifelike, with ruby red lips, defined eyebrows, and long painted lashes. Some even had beauty marks on subtle smile lines around their mouths. Mrs. Patterson had once mentioned they were part of the store's heritage, though Landon thought they were just too cheap to replace them. The female mannequins wore their molded hair in elegant vintage waves, while the male ones had that classic clean-cut look, like something out of an old magazine. Their faces were eternally youthful, but years of dust and age had given their complexions a sickly, jaundiced tinge. It was during his 3rd week that he first noticed something was off. He was making his usual rounds, flashlight beam sweeping across the designer clothing section on the 3rd floor, when he could have sworn one of the mannequins had turned its head, just slightly, barely a few degrees, but enough to make him stop in his tracks. He played the beam back across the figure, a female mannequin in a blue cocktail dress, but it stood perfectly still, face forward, blank eyes staring into nothing. "Get it together, Mitchell," he muttered, shaking his head. This was what happened when you worked nights. Your mind started playing tricks on you. The next incident occurred 3 days later. He was checking the locks on the 2nd floor when his flashlight caught something that made his blood run cold. A male mannequin in a tailored suit stood in the middle of the main aisle, except Landon distinctly remembered it being part of a window display when he'd started his shift. Its head was cocked at an impossible angle, nearly backwards, those painted eyes fixed on the exact spot where he stood. Landon approached it slowly, his heart hammering. Up close, he could see stress cracks in its plastic skin, like age lines that hadn't been there before. The painted lips seemed different too, slightly upturned at the corners, forming what could almost be a smile. He backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet, and spent the rest of his shift in the security office. The incidents escalated from there. One night, he found all the mannequins in the evening wear department arranged in a circle, their heads bowed together as if in consultation. The next week, he discovered tiny fingerprints in the dust on their joints, as if they had been flexing their fingers. During one particularly unsettling shift, he heard what sounded like whispering coming from the vintage clothing section, only to find several child-sized mannequins lined up along the wall, their painted faces fixed in expressions of innocent joy that seemed somehow mocking. The worst was the night he found footprints, small, perfect impressions in the thin layer of dust on the floor, leading away from empty display platforms. They looked like they'd been made by plastic feet, the joints clearly visible in the prints. They led to the staff break room, stopping abruptly at the old photographs on the wall, the ones showing generations of Marshall's employees, their faces frozen in eerily familiar smiles. Landon started noticing other things too. The way Mrs. Patterson never seemed to look directly at the mannequins when she walked through the store. How the cleaning crew always worked in pairs, moving quickly through the aisles and never turning their backs on the displays. The fact that none of the security cameras ever seemed to point directly at the mannequins, as if by design. During his final week, he began to hear them move. At first, it was just the faint sound of plastic limbs scraping against each other, always just out of sight. Then came the soft tap, tap, tap of rigid feet on marble, quickly silenced when he turned to look. One night, he could have sworn he heard humming, an old song from the 1940s, coming from a group of female mannequins arranged around a display of vintage handbags. But it was what he saw in the mirror that finally broke him. He had been straightening his uniform in the fitting room when he noticed something odd in the reflection. The mannequin behind him, a tall, elegant figure in an evening gown, had its hand raised, reaching for his shoulder. He spun around, but it was posed as always, hand gracefully extended to show off a bracelet. When he looked back at the mirror, though, he could still see it reaching for him, painted lips parted, as if about to speak. That's when he started sleeping in the security office, convinced its thick walls and reinforced door would protect him. He was wrong. Landon started spending more time in the security office, watching the store through the cameras. The office was his sanctuary, with its thick walls and one-way mirrored window overlooking the main floor. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Mannequins didn't move. It was probably the cleaning crew messing with him, though he never saw them touch the displays. Then he found the paper trail of what he called proof. But proof of what, he didn't know. He hadn't meant to go digging into what happened to the previous guard, but curiosity got the better of him. It started with an old employee bulletin he discovered wedged behind the filing cabinet in the security office. The paper was yellowed with age, but he could make out a pattern. Every few years, a night guard would vanish. The official records always listed them as resigned or transferred, but there were never any forwarding addresses, no final paychecks cashed. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. In the employee break room, he found old photographs showing store celebrations and holiday parties. In each decade's photos, he noticed mannequins in the background that seemed oddly familiar, their poses and features resembling missing employees from previous years. The local paper's website had only a small mention: local security guard missing, police suspect foul play. According to the article, Thomas Reynolds had vanished during his shift 3 months ago. His car was still in the parking lot, his belongings untouched in the security office. The only clue was the security footage, which showed him making his rounds at 2:17 a.m. And then, nothing, as if he had simply ceased to exist. The article mentioned that Reynolds had filed several unusual incident reports in the weeks before his disappearance. The police had dismissed them as stress-induced paranoia. The reports themselves weren't public, but Landon could guess what they might have contained. He almost quit that night, should have quit, but the thought of going back to job hunting, of explaining to his mother why he had left such an easy position, kept him there. He just needed to make it through another month, save up enough to look for something better. That's what he told himself when he dozed off in the security office at 3 a.m., the camera monitors casting a pale blue glow across his face. The sound that woke him was barely perceptible, a soft scraping, like plastic dragging across marble. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air had changed. It was heavier, thick with the smell of old plastic and dust, mixed with something sickeningly sweet, like decaying flowers. The temperature in the security office had dropped dramatically, his breath now visible in thin clouds. The security monitors flickered with static, and in those brief moments of interference, he caught glimpses of movement, jerky, unnatural motions as mannequins stepped down from their platforms, their joints creaking like old doors. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the store's PA system, a strange hollow tapping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They were there, dozens of them, pressed against the one-way mirror, their blank faces somehow hungry in the darkness. Male and female mannequins of all sizes, their joints bent at impossible angles, plastic hands splayed against the glass, and they were looking at him. He knew they couldn't see through the mirror, but somehow they knew exactly where he was. The scraping sound came again, their fingers dragging across the glass. Landon lunged for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. He could hear more of them now, moving in the hallway outside the office. The sound of their joints clicking and popping made his skin crawl. His phone. He had to call for help, but when he pulled it from his pocket, the screen showed no signal. Of course not. The store's thick walls had always made reception spotty. The security office had never felt smaller. The mannequins pressed closer to the glass, their weight making it creak. In the monitors, he could see more of them climbing the stairs, dragging themselves up from the lower floors. Their movements were jerky, inhuman, like a stop-motion film played at the wrong speed. The glass began to crack. Landon screamed, pounding on the door, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the store. The emergency exit was 2 floors down. Even if he could get out of the office, they'd catch him long before he reached it. The door suddenly burst open, and their cold plastic hands seized him, dozens of rigid fingers digging into his flesh. He thrashed and fought, but they held him immobile as one of them pressed its featureless face against his. The surface of its head began to soften and melt, flowing like hot wax onto his skin. He tried to scream, but the liquid plastic poured into his mouth, hardening as it went, choking off his air. The pain was excruciating. He could feel the transformation starting at his extremities, his fingers stiffening, joints locking into place as his skin took on an unnatural sheen. His bones crackled as they hollowed out, becoming lightweight and artificial. Every nerve ending felt like it was being dipped in molten plastic, a wave of agony that moved steadily inward from his limbs toward his core. His muscles seized as the change reached his torso, ribs warping and reorganizing themselves into a mannequin's simplified form. He tried to cry out, but his jaw had already fused shut, vocal cords crystallizing into useless strands of polymer. Tears rolled down his cheeks, leaving trails that quickly smoothed over into perfect, unblemished plastic. The last thing he saw in the monitors was his own face, contorted in terror, features melting and reforming into a blank, pristine mask. Then the glass shattered. Lola Jameson had worked at Marshall's for 6 years, long enough to know every inch of the store. So when she arrived for her morning shift and saw the new mannequin in the winter wear section, something about it caught her eye. It was posed naturally enough, one hand in the pocket of its designer jeans, the other reaching up to adjust the collar of its jacket. But there was something about the face that seemed almost familiar, the way the plastic features were arranged in a permanent expression of fear, mouth open in a silent scream. "When did we get this one?" she asked Mrs. Patterson, who was arranging scarves nearby. "Oh, that?" The manager didn't quite meet her eyes. "It came in last night. We're always getting new ones, you know. Can't keep using the same displays forever." Lola nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen that face before. Maybe in the employee break room. But that was silly. After all, it was just a mannequin. She turned away, missing the slight movement of its head as it tracked her progress across the floor. In the security office, the Help Wanted sign was already posted. The position wouldn't stay vacant for long. It never did. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.